ser detenida, no regresar a ser salva, a ser detenida, allá no morir. Sí fue bueno.
I think with me able to transition from being a drug dealer to a hair distributor, I would call myself an entrepreneur. And I always wanted to help other people, no matter what. Even in my drug dealing, I still wanted to help people.
I spoke to a former DEA agent and he said that had Marllory been in the legal world, she could have reached CEO position in some big company, that she was very astute and had very high-end skills, and it just so happens that she decided to apply those in the drug trade instead.
Women were never considered key players in the game of cartels and organized crime. They're always seen as the flower beside the man, or a product of negotiation. However, there are women in this underground world who choose to be different. These women choose to become leaders instead of followers, and they're extremely good at what they do, earning themselves titles like the Queen of the South, Godmother, and Queen of the Pacific. But how did these women manage to find a place for themselves in an industry ruled by men and brutality? Was it coincidental or purposeful? Here are the female lords with the most murders. Digna Valle. Digna Valle came from the town of El Espiritu in Honduras. This place was where the Valles family ruled, which meant they were the law. People answered to the Valles in this area. They had absolute control over what was going on in this town. Basically, they created their own government.
Many of the border regions in Latin America are very lawless and are characterized by an absence of the state. So you have families like the Valle cartel sort of being these alternative powers and creating their own kind of governance.
Digna Valle was the leader of her cartel, and she ruled the town like it was a part of her clan. She was known as Doña Digna. She and her family were reported to have moved tens of thousands of dollars worth of a month across the border of Guatemala since 2009. They had major connections to some of Latin America's major criminal organizations, including the notorious Sinaloa cartel. The Valles also had people working in the United States to help them with sorting and distributing their narcotics and substances within the country. Their operation remained successful for decades, and Valle earned a reputation for her ruthlessness and cruelty. However, in December 2013, Digna Valle, her brothers, and her son were accused of conspiring to traffic large numbers of substances into the United States through Honduras. They were eventually arrested in July 2014 at the Miami International Airport. Valle and her brothers were supposed to receive 10-year sentences, but she took a plea deal and cooperated with the authorities to take down her family's narcotic operations and many other major trafficking and distribution networks in Honduras. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison. After she was released, Valle fought tooth and nail to remain in the United States and not be deported back to her country, because she knew the price she'd have to pay for betraying her family and other major narcotic organizations. It was hard to believe this woman was once the top player in the game of organized crime. Digna Valle is now trying to survive one day at a time. Marixa Lemus, the female version of El Chapo in Guatemala, was indeed a woman of power. Lemus was literally born into a family of crime and power. She was destined to rule this empire. In the city of Ciudad Pedro de Alvarado, which lies on the border of Guatemala and El Salvador, Marixa and her sister Mayra controlled the source of narcotics that were coming in and out of the country. Not only was the Lemus family involved in organized crime, but they also held political influence. Marixa Lemus's brother previously held the position of president of Moyutla, but died after suffering from a heart attack in 2009. Her sister Mayra was voted to become the interim president, and their plan was for her to eventually take over the position. Sadly, Mayra was taken out by a group of armed men after having lunch with her sister to promote her presidential campaign. According to Marixa, she witnessed her sister's life being taken before her eyes and believed that it was the work of their political rival. Marixa ended up replacing her sister in the race for the presidency, and she did everything she could to promote herself. Still, she lost the election to her opponent, which really enraged her. She attempted to take the new president's life several times, but she was unsuccessful. To make things worse for her, in 2015, she was arrested and sentenced to 94 years in prison, but that wasn't the end. In 2016, she attempted to escape prison by climbing over the wall with the help of other inmates. Indeed, she was unsuccessful. In 2017, Marixa tried to escape again by dressing up as a prison guard, but she ended up being arrested 2 weeks later. Though all of her attempts were in vain, Marixa still remains adamant that she will win her freedom. The former queenpin reportedly wants to have her case reopened, and she's determined to fight her way out of the system. Marllory Shakan Rosell, better known as the Queen of the South, was a woman of success in the criminal biosphere full of male figures. Shakan Rosell was a woman of a normal background. Like many other young women, she completed high school and went to college to study psychology. However, she found her life too mundane and boring for her liking. So she decided to drop out of school and founded her own small business. You can say that Shakan Rosell was an amazing businesswoman. Her calculations and numbers are beyond magnificent. She landed herself tons of great connections as well.
I spoke to a former DEA agent and he said that had Marllory been in the legal world, she could have reached CEO position in some big company, that she was very astute and had very high-end skills. And it just so happens that she decided to apply those in the drug trade instead.
The woman ended up assisting others with laundering money and eventually got herself caught up with the narcotic distribution business. By late 2009, Shakan Rosell was the president of the Broadway Commerce Company that was later exposed to be in deep connection with a Colombian organized crime family. The company was only serving as a legitimate shield for them to run their shady business behind the scenes. At this time, Shakan Rosell was considered to be one of the most reputable women in the Central and Latin American area due to her great connections. She was considered an intimidating woman by many people. She reportedly sent thousands of kilos of narcotics across the United States border every month, earning herself millions of dollars worth of income. By the time Shakan Rosell reached her 30s, she was considered the queen of her business empire. U.S. officials traced at least 24 businesses back to her name, which included luxurious hotels, a construction firm, and clothing stores. She was charged with trafficking crime in 2011 and surrendered to the authorities in 2014. Shakan Rosell ended up receiving a reduced sentence for working with law enforcement officials to bring down other major narcotic traffickers, which included some of her former business partners. Yesenia Pacheco, La Güera Loca. Yesenia Pacheco was known as La Güera Loca, or the Crazy Witch. Not much was known about Pacheco's background. It was said that she didn't join the cartel life until 2009. She initially was a member of the Gulf Cartel in Mexico. Pacheco had the skills and talent of a trafficker and hitwoman, but most importantly, she was known for her brutality and ruthlessness. She's the type of person who doesn't go easy on her enemies. Pacheco managed to rise through the cartel ranks rapidly and became one of the high-ranking members of the Gulf Cartel. As Pacheco's position became stronger in the cartel world, she grew more impatient and ruthless. The Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas gang had been engaged in conflict and rivalry for years. Pacheco made it her mission to eliminate the Los Zetas by taking the lives of anyone who had remote connections to them. The hitwoman was determined to terminate her cartel's rival, and the number of people who lost their lives to her grew every day. Pacheco was probably the first female high-ranking leader of the Gulf Cartel who had her own army of women. However, her criminal career ended in tragedy in 2014. Apparently, Pacheco never succeeded in eliminating the Los Zetas gang. Instead, she was captured by the cartel. In a graphic video that was posted by the cartel, Pacheco and other members of her organization were captured and by the members of the Zetas. The footage was nothing short of horrifying. Yesenia Pacheco's criminal life only lasted for approximately 5 years, but her ruthless reputation in the underworld will always be remembered. Jemeker Thompson. Jemeker Thompson was a woman credited for fueling the 1980s crack epidemic in America. As a kid, Thompson and her mother lived a life of poverty. Therefore, she always had the need to make money. It didn't matter how she got the money. She just knew in order to survive in this world, she can't be a poor woman.
I think with me able to transition from being a drug dealer to a hair distributor, I would call myself an entrepreneur. And I always wanted to help other people, no matter what. Even in my drug dealing, I still wanted to help people.
This thought motivated her to turn to selling and distributing at a young age. Thompson started running her own business when she was a high school student. She would sell anywhere between 3 to 4 kilograms a week. She eventually got married and had a son in 1982. She and her husband continued to operate an underground crack business, and they made a fortune out of doing it. Around this time, the DEA started to suspect Thompson and her husband. They began investigating their illegal activities, but before they could come to any conclusion, her husband was murdered. The DEA thought Thompson was going to stop her narcotic business after her husband's death, but she decided to continue anyway. By 1984, Thompson thought to expand her business to an international level. She recruited distributors to work for her and began importing straight from Colombia. The woman was even clever enough to open a hair business to serve as a legitimate front for her to launder the money she made from selling substances. At this point, Thompson was only a young woman in her early 20s, yet she was already playing a main role in the crack epidemic. If you don't know what the crack epidemic is, it was a period in the 1980s when crack was being sold on every corner. There was so much of it being produced and distributed that people would use it to pay for everyday items. So imagine someone walking into a grocery store to buy some milk, but they didn't have enough money, so they paid for it with whatever amount of crack they had in their pocket, and the cashier would take it without a problem. It sounds crazy, but that really happened in the US at one point. As the epidemic got worse, Thompson was making millions. However, her business came to an end when her business partner was arrested for substances being found in his car. Her partner wanted a lesser sentence, so he cooperated with law enforcement authorities by providing them with the information they needed to arrest Thompson. After being betrayed by her partner, she had to go into hiding to avoid capture, but eventually, they caught up to her. Jemeker Thompson ended up being apprehended at her son's 6th grade graduation and was charged with conspiracy to distribute narcotics and money laundering. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. When Thompson was serving her sentence, she had a change of heart. After she was released, she converted to Christianity and founded a Christian ministry called Second Chance Evangelical Ministries. Her change from a queen pin to an average woman and devoted Christian was something to be amazed by. Also, her story and transformation made her the subject of the media. To say the least, Thompson had a better outcome than many other women who involved themselves in the narco business. Luz Irene Fajardo Campos, also known as La Madrina or La Comadre, came from a farming family in the more rural part of Sinaloa, Mexico. She lived an average life. Her family was considered substantial. You can say she didn't have as difficult a life compared to other women who eventually rose to power in the criminal empire. It's hard to imagine a young girl from an average family who wasn't involved in organized crime would later become one of the most influential figures in the narcotic trafficking industry. Campos became a lawyer, meaning she had significant knowledge about the legal system. The woman had an amazing career, but for some unknown reason, she decided to change paths. Campos wanted to create her own criminal cell to traffic amphetamines instead of practicing her legal profession. Surprisingly, she was extremely good at what she did. Her narcotic business took off in no time. Campos started utilizing planes to transport her substances from Colombia into Mexico and the United States. Her network expanded all over Central and Latin America, earning her many powerful allies like the Sinaloa cartel. She also resorted to bribing Mexican and Colombian officials to transport narcotics through the international airline, which benefited her greatly. After a while, Campos not only trafficked narcotics, but also chemicals used to create these substances. She would oversee the transport and arrival of these chemicals and distribute them to laboratories for creating narcotics. People in organized crime had mad respect for this woman due to her talent for overseeing this many shipments. Due to her efforts, Campos became a significant target for North American authorities. Not only was she the head of a narcotic trafficking organization responsible for bringing substances into her region, but she also possessed knowledge about the inner workings of the Sinaloa cartel and the operations of El Chapo. Unexpectedly, she was captured in 2017 at the Bogotá International Airport in Colombia, which was the same year El Chapo was extradited to the United States. Not long after her capture, her sons were murdered by the Sinaloa cartel, and their death was meant to be a warning sign to Campos not to cooperate with authorities. Campos ended up pleading not guilty to all her charges, but she was still sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2021. Unlike most women whose fate aligns with organized crime, Campos wasn't forced to become a criminal. She chose to become the godmother of narcotic trafficking and distribution. This woman built an empire of her own. Even though she was gifted with what she did, the consequences eventually caught up with her. Guadalupe Fernandez Valencia was also known as the highest-ranking woman in the Sinaloa cartel, working beside El Chapo, the notorious Mexican kingpin.
With El Chapo looking at up to life in prison at sentencing next month, his right-hand woman is on the verge of pleading guilty in a Chicago courtroom. Guadalupe Fernandez Valencia was the chief financial officer for Chapo's Sinaloa cartel, managing its billions.
Valencia had a history of narcotic trafficking way before she joined the Sinaloa cartel in 2009. As a young woman, she took an interest in dealing with narcotics. Therefore, she migrated to America to set up her business within the country in the 1990s. After she set up shop in California, her business and connections in the States grew. She gained quite a reputation in the narcotic distribution industry within a few years. Her transactions were above and beyond until she was arrested in 1998. Valencia was sentenced to 10 years in prison and was sent back to Mexico after her release in 2007. After returning to her home country, Valencia returned to her old ways and started working with traffickers again. It was around this time that she joined the Sinaloa cartel and worked her way up the ranks rapidly. She became the right-hand woman to one of El Chapo's sons and helped them traffic tons of narcotics into the U.S. border. She was at the height of her career between the years of 2009 and 2014, earning herself the title of La Patrona, which means female boss. She was arrested once again in 2016, not long after the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo, was captured for good. She spent some time in the U.S. prison system until 2017 when she was deported back to Mexico. In 2019, Valencia received a short sentence of 10 years in prison for cooperating with law enforcement. However, by supplying information to law enforcement, Valencia took a huge risk that could affect her life and the safety of her family. From previous cases, we know that the Sinaloa cartel doesn't take betrayal so lightly. It was reported that Valencia had 5 children, but their whereabouts are unknown. Valencia will eventually be released from prison and have to face the consequences of the cartel world. Sandra Avila Beltran. Next is a Mexican narcotic lord who was dubbed the Queen of Cartels or Queen of the Pacific, and one of the only leading women in the underworld.
México hay mucha corrupción, pero no es nomás con el narcotráfico, hay mucha corrupción en cualquier ámbito social.
Sandra Avila Beltran was born on October 16, 1960, in Baja California, Mexico. To make things more interesting, Avila Beltran was raised in an organized crime family, which sealed her dark fate. Her parents were related to Rafael Caro Quintero, a former leader of the legendary Guadalajara cartel. If you haven't heard of the Guadalajara cartel, it's basically the origin of all the modern-day cartels and narcotic organizations. Avila Beltran was said to be the niece of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the godfather of the Latin American narcotics industry. The man was known for the brutal abduction and murder of a DEA agent in 1984 and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. However, his legacy lived on. As you can see, Avila Beltran had no way of escaping her fate. She was destined to become immersed in the criminal world. Still, a woman being born into a crime family usually means they'll become the wife or mistress of some cartel leader or crime boss. But not Avila Beltran. She decided to be different. Instead of waiting to become some guy's eye candy, Avila Beltran used her family connection to the best of her advantage. Over the years, she built an amazing relationship between the Mexican and Colombian cartels, creating a great source of narcotic transactions. Avila Beltran had many relationships and well-known affairs in her life. Still, the one that stands out the most is her relationship with Juan Diego Espinoza Ramirez, also known as the Tiger, a powerful figure in the Colombian Norte del Valle cartel. It was through this person that Avila Beltran rose to the height of her power. In 2001, authorities managed to locate one of her shipments in the Pacific port of Manzanillo, Colima, discovering more than 9 tons. They traced the shipment back to Avila Beltran and Espinoza Ramirez. After the disclosure of this information, the media gave her the name the Queen of the Pacific because of her skills in organizing fleets of narcotic shipments across the ocean. Avila Beltran remained a well-respected figure in the Mexican cartel world, and she stayed off the law enforcement radar for 3 decades until 2002, when she contacted authorities to help her locate her abducted teenage son. They did help her find her son. However, she became their next target. Avila Beltran knew that she was exposing herself to danger by contacting law enforcement authorities, but she was willing to risk it all for her son's safety. It did take 4 years and the work of 30 agents, but Avila Beltran was finally arrested in 2007. She was extradited to the United States for her charges in 2011. The Queen of the Pacific was sentenced to 70 months of prison in the U.S. in 2013. After she was released, Avila Beltran was deported back to Mexico, where she served more time behind bars. Avila Beltran was officially freed in 2015. She reportedly returned to live in Guadalajara and has since tried to live a silent life, but to no avail because her reputation remains the center of discussion in the underworld. Also, being one of the most notorious queenpins, Avila Beltran found herself constantly bombarded by the media. The Queen of the Pacific may never know the true definition of a peaceful life. Griselda Blanco. Griselda Blanco was known as the Black Widow or Godmother. She was one of the most prominent queenpins of the late 1900s. Griselda Blanco was raised in Medellin, Colombia, where she was exposed to the criminal lifestyle at a young age. Her family didn't care to provide her with a proper education. Therefore, Blanco spent the majority of her time on the street, committing minor offenses. It was reported that Blanco attempted an abduction for ransom at the age of 11. By the time she was 13, she was an expert at pickpocketing. To make matters worse, it turned out that Blanco was constantly abducted in her own home by her mother's boyfriend, It was as if everyone around her was feeding into his toxic lifestyle. Therefore, at 19 years old, Blanco decided enough was enough and ran away from home to escape the... After she ran away, Blanco immersed herself deeper into a life of crime. She made a living out of looting until she was 20 years old. So this woman had acquired quite a criminal record before she even reached her 20s. By 1964, Blanco had started a family with her second husband and had 4 children. Her husband was the person who introduced her to the narco world, and she decided she wanted to capitalize on it in a wider market. Therefore, she decided to immigrate illegally to the United States. Blanco started her first narco business in New York and had a successful run until she was caught by the authorities in 1975. However, she managed to flee the country before anyone could catch up to her. The next time Blanco returned to the U.S. was in the late 1970s, when she was credited for starting the Miami War, which was an epidemic of crimes and public violence fueled by... The war left the city of Miami in chaos until the early 1980s. The amount of narcotics that were distributed during these years was worth more than $80 billion per month. Besides being a spectacular businesswoman, Blanco also built a ruthless and unforgiving reputation. Blanco was arrested on February 17, 1985, by the DEA and charged with conspiring to manufacture, import, and distribute narcotics, ending her reign as the godmother. She was eventually sentenced to 20 years in prison. In 2004, Blanco was released from prison and was allowed to return home to Colombia, where she lived a quiet life with her family, away from the narcotic world. Unfortunately, on September 3, 2012, Blanco was gunned down by an unknown person outside a butcher shop, ending the life of one of the most notorious female narcos in Latin America. Sebastiana Vasquez. Finally, a woman who was feared by many in Guatemala's narcotic trafficking industry. Sebastiana Vasquez, also known as La Tana, Doña Tana, or La Doña, was not born into a crime family or had any connections to the narcotic world. However, she was brought up in an extremely toxic environment. Vasquez's father was a very abusive man who constantly hurt her and her mother. She lived the majority of her life in poverty and had to drop out of school in the 2nd grade. Growing up in the town of Malacatan, which borders Mexico, Vasquez was exposed to many societal biases against women. To add insult to injury, she ended up being taken by an unknown man when she was only 18 years old. Imagine being in Vasquez's shoes. It must have been horrifying for a teenager to be taken away from home by an abductor. Even though she didn't have a good family to come home to, it still didn't give anyone the right to abduct her. This further illustrates the concept of women's inferiority in this society. The man who abducted Vasquez eventually became somewhat of a husband to her. He practically forced her to marry him. They had 5 children together, and this man was as toxic as Vasquez's father. He was an and domineering man who eventually abandoned her and her kids, which might be a blessing in disguise. However, Vasquez has now been left with 5 kids and no way to support her family. She had to start selling contraband products to support her kids. Not long after, she married another man who was a local cartel leader. He was eventually killed by a rival organization. You can say Vasquez never had the family of her dreams. After her husband died, she took over as the leader of the narcotic organization and also became the most feared woman in Guatemala. Over the years, Vasquez developed great connections with Digna Valle's cartel in Honduras, multiple narcotic organizations in Colombia, and even the notorious Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. With her connections, she was in charge of transporting narcotics from Colombia to Guatemala and eventually to the Mexican and United States markets. Over the course of her career, Vasquez managed to transport an insane amount of narcotics across the Guatemala border. She was also laundering a large amount of money by opening hardware shops, investing in real estate, and passing it off as legitimate income. For years, her reputation was polished by the cartel industry. Though her reign came to an end in 2014 when she was arrested by the DEA, she was soon released in 2019 and returned to her hometown in Guatemala. It is unknown whether the legendary female narco boss retired or went back to her narcotic ways. Among all of these female lords, who stood out the most to you? Feel free to tell us your thoughts in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications.